Mobilization for the Civil War. And you'll notice here we are on chapter 15. I'm going to go ahead and spoil what's going to happen with the Civil War, but I wanted to give you a heads up before I got into all the details of the war itself. In the end, the Civil War is going to firstly preserve the Union. The Union will win, the North will win, and thus the United States of America is going to be preserved as it was before. It will also, in the end, abolish slavery. Although that wasn't an original goal, it will happen during the war. We're also going to see at least 620,000 American soldiers die in this conflict. And you have to keep in mind that Americans are on both sides of the conflict because it's a civil war. This is more than any other war the country had fought, in fact, combined. Now, the Confederate objectives are going to dictate a more defensive military strategy, while the Union objectives are going to have to dictate an offensive strategy. However, neither the North or the South was ready for a major war. First of all, the so-called Confederacy is trying to establish a new nation, and so they didn't have any kind of national army. Now, the southern states did have militias, but by the 1850s, a lot of these were more like social clubs than actual like fighting units. Whereas the Union side did have a regular army, but it was only 16,000 men at this point, and most of them were actually stationed west of the Mississippi to deal with like Native American attacks. So both sides are going to need thousands of new recruits, and both sides are going to have to develop a bureaucracy to mount this war effort. The administrations of the presidents on both sides are going to have to secure the loyalty of their civilian populations and really devise military strategies for war. But we are going to get war fever early on. The thing is, we saw with the end of the last video, Lincoln moved to enlarge the army by mobilizing state militias for 90 days. And it was at that point that Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee refused, and they seceded the nation and joined the so-called Confederacy. When they left, about 1/3 of the officer corps, including a lot of like high-ranking officers, also are going to resign the Union's army and join the so-called Confederacy's side. We even see this with, most famously, is Colonel Lee, who I'm going to call Colonel Lee because he only got to that rank in the United States Army. He was only given the rank of general in the so-called Confederacy's army, and as the so-called Confederacy is never a legitimate nation, you can't necessarily say he actually legitimately ever had that rank. Anyway, both sides are going to refuse, or both sides, I should say, believe the war is going to end quickly. And we're going to see like Douglas and the Democrats are going to offer their party support. And Douglas is going to say there are no neutrals in this war, only patriots and traitors. And I want you to keep that in mind as we're going through this, that the South, the so-called Confederacy, they were literally traitors to the Union. You cannot just secede a country. You see a lot of nationalism, though, on both sides. American flags are flying everywhere, and Southerners also were equally eager to support their supposed new nation. You get things like the rebel yell, which is high-pitched, piercing sounds. You can go look it up on YouTube if you want to. You get whole enlistment rallies, wild send-offs at train stations, auctions, and balls to raise money for troops. You really have this feeling of like holy war unfolding and energizing recruits, and you get a lot of people rushing to sign up and fight for their nation's rights and everything. The Union, very much they wanted to say this is the cause of liberty and light, the cause of God, whereas the so-called Confederacy is like the cause is just and God is just. Thus we see, like I said, holy war unfolding. Volunteers rushing in to join in and fill quotas. But this initial enthusiasm is going to wear off quickly. And the South is actually going to have a hard time because for decades they've been fighting to defend, states' rights against a national authority. And yet here they are trying to establish the so-called Confederacy as a new nation, which makes it very difficult when you're saying states' rights over the new nation that you're supposedly forming. We're going to see the South, in fact, is going to be forced to have the first general draft in American history in 1862. Although, make no mistake, the North will actually follow and have their own draft literally just a couple months later. In the South, though, there was several different exemptions to being drafted. For instance, if you were a white man that had 20 slaves or more, you were excused from service. Now, the reason for this was trying to basically ensure the security and production of large plantations. It wasn't about protecting the privileged, but in many ways, that's exactly what it did. A lot of people felt like this was a rich man's war because it was being fought over slavery. Slavery caused the Civil War, and the number one thing the South wanted to do was to keep slavery more than anything else. And so that's a rich man's war, but that it was a poor man's fight because they weren't necessarily the ones being drafted. Enthusiasm, though, like I said, will fade in the North as well. We see that some states in the North start a draft as early as the summer of 1862, and Congress would actually pass the Enrollment Act draft law that allowed for certain exemptions, like occupational exemptions, or also one could hire a substitute. But this, once again, aroused resentment amongst the working class because they couldn't afford to pay for a substitute. And so we are going to see anger at the draft and like poor working conditions are going to spark several riots during like 1863. This is going to be in the North and in the South. But the North is going to be a lot less dependent on the draft than the South overall, partly because of a lot larger population. Now, the people who are going to actually be in the Army would include men from all lines of life, and you even get women who would typically disguise themselves as men and basically serve in both the North and the South for the same kind of reasons men signed up. Adventure, patriotism, glory.